The evening was still and cold. On a deserted street, lit by dim street lamps, a small car was parked at the curb. A woman sat inside, quietly listening to the radio. Her eyes were fixed on the road ahead, her face radiating calm. But the silence was suddenly broken by the screeching of brakes, and a police car pulled up next to her. Two officers got out. One of them, a tall, white man with a stern expression, approached the car. His partner stayed behind, holding a flashlight that he aimed straight at the driver's window. "Get out of the car," the first policeman said curtly, his voice firm but devoid of any warmth. A woman, feeling her heart beat faster, turned her head towards the officers. She looked calm, but there was a hint of worry in her eyes. "I'm sorry, but I can't get out," she said, her voice soft but confident. "I'm disabled. I have no limbs." The policeman frowned, his expression darkening slightly, as if her answer were a challenge. He exchanged glances with his partner, who looked equally tense. "It doesn't matter," the first officer said, his voice even harder. "We said get out. Do it." The woman sighed, trying to remain calm. She knew that any mistake or word could make this situation worse. "Sir, I can't go out," she repeated. "I physically don't have the ability to do so. If there's anything you need to know, I'm willing to cooperate." But the woman's words did not soften him. The policeman took a step closer. His voice grew louder. "Did you hear me? I said get out of the car." His voice echoed across the empty street. At that moment, the woman felt her calm begin to crack. She tried to explain again, but her words were ignored again. The policeman opened the car door. His actions were abrupt. Her heart began to beat even faster. She felt that the situation was getting out of control. "Wait," she managed to exclaim. "I'm not refusing to cooperate. Just tell me what you need." But the policeman didn't listen. His rigid movements showed that he wasn't going to change his mind. The tension in the air grew with each passing second, turning this evening into a nightmare. The policeman leaned toward the open door, his face impatient and irritated. The woman, sitting in her car, tried to maintain her composure. Her voice was even, though her chest was tight with tension. "Officer," she said, looking at him, "I am ready to answer your questions. But, as I said, I cannot get out of the car. It is simply physically impossible." The policeman grinned, his grin cold, almost contemptuous. "Of course it's impossible," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Everyone has excuses when it comes to complying with the law." "That's not an excuse," she said, her voice shaking, but she quickly regained her composure. "I have no limbs. That's not an excuse. That's a fact." The police officer's partner stood a little behind her, holding a flashlight, the beam of which was aimed directly at her face. His silence did not make the situation any easier. The woman felt her heart begin to beat faster. "A fact," the policeman chuckled. "You think your condition exempts you from obeying the law. If everyone thought that, there would be chaos here. I haven't broken any laws," she tried to explain. "If you explain what you need, I'll do everything in my power to cooperate." The policeman nodded slowly, but there was no understanding in his eyes. "Everything in your power," he repeated. "You know, it seems you're used to people treating you with pity." These words made her freeze. She felt a wave of humiliation run through her body, but she took a deep breath, trying not to give in to her emotions. "It's not about pity," she replied, her voice firm. "It's about dignity and respect." The policeman leaned closer, his face only inches from hers. "Dignity, respect," he repeated, as if tasting the words. "How about you show me you deserve it?" The phrase sounded like a challenge. The woman felt her anger rising, but she knew that any display of emotion would only make this situation worse. "I didn't insult anyone. I didn't threaten anyone. I didn't break the law," she answered calmly. "Why are you treating me like this?" The policeman straightened up, his grin widening. "Why? Because I can. Because you sit in the car, demanding special treatment instead of simply following directions. Do you think your status allows you to evade our demands?" The words were cold, but the woman understood that behind them was a desire to dominate, to make her submit. Her gaze remained firm. "I'm here to cooperate," she said, "but I won't be treated with disrespect." The policeman frowned, his face hardening. It seemed he had not expected such a reaction. Silence hung in the air, but the tension did not ease. The woman knew that more trials lay ahead, but she was ready to stand for her dignity, no matter what. The policeman took a step back, but his gaze remained sharp as a blade. His partner stood silently behind him, holding a flashlight, but now the light was directed not only at the woman, but also at her car. The lighting created a threatening atmosphere, heightening her sense of vulnerability. "Are you one of those people who always expect special treatment?" the policeman said, his voice caustic. "You think it's enough to say you're disabled and everyone will forget about the rules." The woman swallowed, trying to suppress the lump in her throat. Her voice was even but quiet. "I'm not asking anyone to make exceptions for me. I'm only asking for understanding. I want to cooperate, but you must take my situation into account." "Consider," the policeman asked, his voice filled with mockery. "Let's get this straight. You're driving a car that you clearly can drive yourself. Who's driving then? Your condition doesn't relieve you of responsibility. I have special devices for driving a car," she answered calmly, although her hands were shaking. "It's all documented and legal." But her words only increased his irritation. He gestured to his partner to check the license plates and documents. "You know, I think people like you get praised often for doing the least amount of work," he continued, leaning closer. "You're used to getting breaks, but in the real world, no one will make exceptions for you." The words were cruel, their sharpness cutting deeper than she had expected. She felt her lips tremble, but she controlled herself. Her answer was quiet but firm. "My position does not make me less of a man. I do not ask for indulgences. I ask for respect." The policeman laughed, but there was no humor in his laughter. "Respect," he said. "Respect must be earned. What have you done? Just sit here talking about your rights, instead of following my instructions." Her patience was at its limit, but she knew that any harsh word could lead to a worse outcome. She remained silent, maintaining her calm, although her chest burned with humiliation. The partner returned, handing the documents to the first officers. "Everything is clear," he said, avoiding looking the woman in the eyes. The policeman frowned but said nothing. He turned back to the woman, his gaze cold. "You've been lucky today," he said, as if challenging her, "but I warn you, if I spot you again, you won't be able to use your position as a shield anymore." She looked at him, her eyes full of pain, but she didn't allow herself to respond. The policeman took a step back, signaling that she could leave, but his last words echoed in her ears, a reminder of how unfair this world could be. When they left, the woman sat her in the car, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she fought back tears. The evening had become further proof to her of how often people judge each other not by their actions, but by their preconceived notions. She knew her fight had only just begun. The police officers walked away slowly, their footsteps thumping on the deserted street. The woman sat her in her car, trying to catch her breath. Her hands were still shaking from the strain, and the officers' words were like blows in her head. She knew they were gone, but the feeling of their gaze, their mocking tone, still lingered. Inside, she wanted to prove that she was not who they thought she was. But suddenly, she noticed one of the policemen stop, discussing something with his partner. Then they turned around and began slowly approaching her car. Her heart began to pound. "What else do they want?" she thought, gripping the steering wheel. "One more thing," the first officer said, approaching her car again. "We want to inspect your vehicle." Her voice trembled, but she tried to speak calmly. "Do you have a warrant?" "A warrant?" His grin was insulting. "Do you think you have the right to demand something?" She knew the situation was getting out of control again. The partner, who had stayed behind, turned on the flashlight again, pointing it at her face. It wasn't just awkward. It was humiliating. "You've exceeded your authority," she said, her voice firm even as her insides clenched with fear. "If you want to inspect my car, you'll have to have a reason." "The reasons?" The officers crossed his arms, his voice growing even harsher. "The reasons are that you are a problem. There are too many of you, and they all think they can make their own rules." The words hit her like a blow. She knew they weren't just about her. She knew there was more to the phrase than just personal hostility. It was a reflection of the prejudice she'd faced her entire life. She took a deep breath and looked straight at the officers. "I've written down your badge number," she said, "and I'll report your behavior. You've exceeded your authority." The words made him freeze for a moment, but then he stepped closer, his face contorted with anger. "Are you threatening me?" His voice became cold as steel. "No," she answered calmly. "I'm defending my rights." Her answer was unexpected for him. He expected fear, submission, but instead he met with firmness. His partner, standing behind him, cleared his throat as if he wanted to say something, but remained silent. It was at that moment that a car appeared from the other end of the street. Headlights illuminated the scene, and tension filled the air. The car pulled closer, and the driver's door opened. A man in a formal suit stepped out, his confident steps cutting through the silence. His face was stern, but his eyes were determined. "What's going on here?" he asked, looking straight at the officers. The policemen exchanged glances, their confidence beginning to crack. The woman in the car recognized the man. It was a lawyer, known for his cases against police abuse. Her heart began to beat faster, but not with fear, but with hope. "It's none of your business," the first officer snapped, trying to regain control. "You're wrong," the lawyer said, pulling out his phone. "I represent this woman, and this is my case now." The officers frowned. Their positions began to weaken. The woman, watching this, felt for the first time all evening that justice might prevail. The lawyer stood between the woman in the car and the police officers like an unshakable wall. The headlights illuminated his stern face, and although his voice was calm, there was a hint of steel in it. "Your actions exceed your authority," he said, looking directly at the senior officers. "I am recording everything that happens here." The policeman, the one who had been acting most aggressively, did not look away. On the contrary, he stepped forward, clearly intending not to give in. "Write down as much as you want," he snapped, "but that doesn't change the fact that I'm conducting an investigation. You're nobody here." His voice was sharp. His words seemed aimed not just at the lawyer, but also at the woman in the car. She had been sitting in the shadows, watching the scene unfold, feeling her heart beat faster. Every word the policeman said seemed like another blow. "Nobody," the lawyer repeated, his eyebrows raised. "Perhaps you have forgotten that I have every right to represent her interests." "Represent who?" The officers chuckled, his tone venomous. "A woman who can't even get out of her car. Do you think she's capable of understanding what's going on here? Or do you think she deserves something better?" The words sounded like thunder. The woman felt her breath catch. She knew that such people often allowed themselves such words, but now it was too much, too direct, too cruel. The lawyer took a step closer, his face becoming even more serious. "If you continue," he said slowly, deliberately, "I will file a formal request for an investigation into your conduct. You are jeopardizing not only your career, but the reputation of the entire department." "Are you threatening me?" The officer bared his teeth, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. "Do you really think I am afraid of your status as a lawyer?" The officer's partner coughed softly, as if trying to stop him, but the first policeman merely waved him off. "You know there are too many like her," he continued, gesturing at the woman. "They think their special status gives them the right to avoid responsibility. Well, she won't do that in front of me." These words were spoken with such contempt that the lawyer felt anger flaring up in his chest, but he remained calm. "Her special status, as you call it, is nothing more than her human rights," he said, "and it is your duty as an officer to protect those rights, not to use your power to humiliate them." The officer's frowned for a moment, his face contorted. He knew the situation was getting out of his control, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "You think you know everything," he hissed, "but this street, this neighborhood, this is my place, and here I decide what is right and what is wrong." These words, despite their provocative nature, betrayed his weakness. The lawyer was not going to give in. "This is your place?" he asked, taking a step forward. "Then you should know that every step you take will be documented, every word you say, and every action you take. If you want this place to continue to be yours, think about how you behave." The woman in the car listened to this verbal duel unfold, feeling a mixture of fear and gratitude boiling within her. Her voice was weak but firm when she finally spoke. "You shouldn't treat me like this. I haven't done anything wrong." These simple words, spoken with incredible dignity, silenced the officers. For a moment there was silence, broken only by the noise of distant machines. The officer's partner stepped forward, placing his hand on his shoulder. "Maybe we should finish here," he said quietly, but firmly enough. "We've done our job." The officers gave him a look of irritation, but then stepped back. His face remained hard, but he knew he had lost. "We'll meet again," he said before turning and heading toward his car. The lawyer stood watching them go, his gaze cold and determined. When they were out of sight, he turned to the woman. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft. She nodded, though her eyes were filled with tears, This evening had shown her how far people would go in their disrespect, but it had also reminded her that there were those who would stand up for her. The night grew even darker, as if nature itself had decided to hide this episode under a blanket of silence. The woman Saturday in her car, her heart still pounding, the policeman's words echoed in her head, making her feel humiliated but not broken. The lawyer stood next to the car, his stern gaze directed at where the police had just disappeared. His silence spoke louder than words, as if he were preparing for something greater. "They won't come back," he said finally, but there was caution in his voice. "At least, not today." The woman nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was still being watched. Her eyes, filled with anxiety, slid along the street, looking for shadows that could be anything from trees to lurking figures. "Why did they do that?" she finally asked, her voice barely audible. It was unjustified, even cruel. The lawyer looked at her. His face became softer, but there was firmness in his eyes. "It's not just about you," he said. "It's about the system. People who are used to abusing their power, using every opportunity to prove their superiority. But today they met resistance, and it made them angry." The woman took a deep breath, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, as if it was the only anchor keeping her in reality. "Do you think they'll just leave it like this?" Her voice trembled, but there was hidden strength in it. The lawyer smiled slightly, but his smile was bitter. "No," he said, "such people don't leave. But we have what they fear most: facts and attention. Their actions are recorded. Now it's important not to let them escape." The woman felt her fear mingle with determination. She knew this situation was more than just a personal grievance. It was something bigger, something that affected not only her but also other people who might find themselves in her place. At that moment, something caught her attention. She turned her head and noticed a glint of light on the opposite side of the street. It was a subtle glint, like someone's phone or camera. Her heart sank. "Someone is there," she whispered, pointing to the place. The lawyer turned quickly, his eyes narrowing as he searched for the source of the light. He took a few steps forward, but the light disappeared, leaving only shadows. "Maybe they're journalists," he said, though there was a note of doubt in his voice, "or someone else who's monitoring the situation." The woman felt her breathing quicken. The thought of being watched was both frightening and intriguing. Who could it be? The police, returning to make sure she was not a threat, or someone who wanted to use the situation to their advantage. "We have to be careful," the lawyer continued, returning to the car. "It could just be a random person, or it could be something more." They exchanged glances, full of tension and mutual understanding. The woman understood that this night would be the beginning of something new for her. She could no longer be passive. Her story was now part of something bigger, and she had to find the strength to go all the way. "What next?" she asked, her voice firmer. The lawyer looked at her with approval. "We will make sure that their actions do not go unnoticed," he said. "But to do this, we need your determination. It will not be easy." She nodded, feeling a determination well up inside her that she hadn't known before. This was more than a fight for justice. This was a fight for her dignity, for the right to be heard and respected. Meanwhile, across the street, in the shadows, someone slowly put away their phone and walked away into the darkness, disappearing without a trace. The figure was unnoticeable, but its presence left the feeling that this night was far from over. The night was not growing calmer. The tension that hung in the air seemed to be growing. The woman Saturday in the car, feeling her fear mingle with growing determination. The lawyer stood nearby, looking in the direction where the figure in the shadows had recently disappeared. He was silent, but his posture betrayed his anxiety. He held his phone in his hands, but did not call, as if he were waiting for something or someone. "Do you think they'll come back?" the woman finally asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was quiet but firm. Her eyes were still searching for the glimmer of light she'd seen earlier. The lawyer turned slowly towards her, his gaze focused. "It's possible," he said after a pause. "Situations like this rarely end without a hitch. They're used to acting with impunity, and I don't think they'll like it if someone stops them." His words confirmed her fears, but she did not allow herself to panic. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly, but inside, she felt a new strength growing within her. She could no longer be just a victim. She had to fight. The lawyer walked up to the passenger door and knocked on the glass. "Can I sit down?" he asked. "I think we need to discuss what to do next." She nodded, unlocking the door. He got in, closed the door behind him, and turned on the light to see her face. There was a shadow of weariness on his face, but also determination. "We have two options," he began, his voice slow but confident. "We can leave this behind, file a complaint, and hope that the system will at least partially work, or we can move on." "Next?" she asked, her voice cautious but interested. "The next step is to attract attention. Publish a video, tell journalists, create public resonance. But it's not easy. This will attract attention to you, and not only positive attention." Her eyes widened as she realized the enormity of his offer. She knew it could change everything, but she also knew they would make her a target. "Which of these paths is safer?" she asked, her voice full of doubt. "Safer," the lawyer chuckled, but there was no humor in his grin. "In situations like these, safety is relative, but sometimes, to change something, you have to take a risk." Her gaze lingered on his face, studying his expression. He was serious, but she could see that he believed his words. "I want this to end," she said finally. "I want no one else to go through this. What do I need to do?" His face became softer, but his voice remained firm. "First of all, you have to be prepared. It won't be easy. You will be judged, accused, perhaps threatened, but I will be there, and not just me. If we do it right, it might attract those who will support you." She nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "I'm ready," she said. "I don't want this to just go away. I want them to answer for what they did." The lawyer smiled, his face becoming a little brighter for the first time all evening. "Good, then let's begin." But before he could continue, the sound of an engine broke the silence. They both tensed, turning their heads towards the street. The car they had seen earlier was slowly approaching. Its headlights illuminated them, causing them both to shield their eyes with their hands. "Is it them?" the woman whispered, her voice filled with anxiety. The lawyer did not answer immediately. He was looking at the car that had stopped on the opposite side of the street. The door opened, and a figure in dark clothes came out. The man stood as if watching them. He had a phone in his hands, and the light from the screen was directed towards them. "It's not the police," the lawyer said, his voice hardening, "but it's someone who knows more than we do." "What should we do?" Her voice trembled, but she tried not to show her fear. "Wait," he said, "or find out what they need." The figure took a step forward, and the lawyer rolled down the window. "Who are you?" he asked loudly, his voice cutting through the silence of the night. The man paused, then answered, but his voice was too quiet for them to hear. He gestured for them to come closer. The lawyer turned to the woman. "Are you ready?" he asked, looking into her eyes. She nodded, even though her heart was pounding as if it was about to burst out of her chest. "Then let's go," he said, opening the door. The night hid the answers, but she knew that no matter how dangerous this road was, she could not turn back. The figure on the street frowned, as if awaiting their decision. The lawyer got out of the car first, carefully closing the door behind him, and took a few steps forward. A woman remained inside, watching through the window, but she could not tear her eyes away from what was happening. The night, which already seemed endless to her, was becoming more and more ominous. The alienated light of the street lamp emphasized the silhouette of the stranger, making his presence even more tense. "Who are you?" the lawyer asked again, his voice firm but not overly aggressive. He knew it was important not to lose his composure. The man slowly approached, and now in the light of the lantern, it became clear that he was a man. He looked middle-aged, with a thick shadow of stubble on his face and an intense look. In his hands he held a phone, but now the screen was turned off. "You need to know the truth," he said quietly, but his voice was filled with a strange mixture of determination and anxiety. "What are you talking about?" the lawyer asked, taking a step closer but remaining alert. "About what happened here, and about what happens in this city every day," the man replied. His gaze darted to the car where the woman was sitting, and about how she's not the first. The woman felt her blood run cold. She opened the car door and tried to move forward to be closer to the conversation. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice tense. She couldn't afford to remain silent, even though fear was taking hold of her. The man looked straight at her, his face tired, as if he was carrying a burden that was too heavy to share with others. "It's not just a coincidence," he said. "People like you are always persecuted here. They think they can do whatever they want, and no one will ever stop them." Her breathing quickened. She felt anger boiling inside her, mixed with helplessness. She knew the world was full of injustice, but hearing it so directly, so coldly, was unbearable. "Do you have evidence?" the lawyer interjected, his voice sharp. "You talking about serious things. If it's true, why are you here? Why didn't you go to the police or the press?" The man chuckled, but his smile was full of bitterness. "Do you really think this will work?" he asked. "How many times have you seen these things come to light? They're covering for each other. If you want to fight this, you're going to have to play by their rules." The lawyer fell silent, but his eyes did not move from the man. He was assessing him, trying to figure out how serious he was about what he was saying. "Why are you helping us?" the woman asked, her voice cautious, but there was already a note of determination in it. The man looked down as if he was thinking for a moment. "Because I'm tired of seeing it, tired of being silent," he replied. "They think they can act with impunity. But if you're ready to fight, I'm ready to help." The lawyer looked at the woman, and their eyes met. He saw doubt in her eyes, fear, but also something more, a determination that was beginning to break through her vulnerability. "What do you propose?" the lawyer asked, returning his gaze to the man. "I have records," he said. "Videos, photographs, documents. All of this shows how far they can go. But for it to become a weapon, you have to be prepared for the consequences." "Consequences?" the woman asked again. "They won't stop if they feel you're threatening their position," he said quietly. "You'll become a target for them." The man's words hung in the air like a warning. The woman felt her breathing slow. She knew he was right. If she agreed to fight, her life would never be the same. But she also knew that she could no longer remain silent. This evening had become the final line for her, beyond which her fear had to give way to action. She looked at the lawyer, and he nodded, understanding her decision. "Show us what you have," she said, her voice firm. The man nodded, his gaze softening, as if he had found in her the ally he had been looking for so long. "Follow me," he said, turning and heading into the darkness. The night remained cold and ominous, but now they had a path that promised answers, but also brought new questions and dangers. The man walked forward without looking back, his steps confident but quick, as if he were afraid he would change his mind if he slowed down. The disabled woman followed in her car, and the lawyer walked beside him, keeping his guard up. The street was growing darker, and every step seemed charged with tension. The night itself seemed to breathe fear, but there was something more to that fear, a sense of change. "Are you sure it's safe?" the woman asked, her voice shaking but with a note of determination. She couldn't afford to doubt any longer. "There's nothing safe about it," the man answered shortly, without turning around. "But the truth is rarely safe." They stopped in front of an old building whose windows were boarded up. The man pulled out his keys and opened the heavy door, gesturing for them to come inside. The car's headlights illuminated the graffiti-covered walls and the cracked asphalt beneath their feet. "Here?" the lawyer asked, his voice reserved but wary. The man nodded. "Everything you need is here, but be prepared. What you see may turn everything upside down." They walked inside, and the man turned on a dim light that lit up above their heads. The room was filled with old desks with stacks of papers, a laptop, and several external drives. On the wall was a screen connected to a surveillance camera. The woman noticed that one of the cameras was pointed directly at the street where they had recently had a run-in with the police. "Did you record this?" she asked, her voice full of surprise and disbelief. The man nodded. "I record everything. This camera is my defense and my tool. I have everything. Recordings of their actions, their words, evidence of their abuses. I was waiting for the moment to use it, and your case was the starting point." The lawyer walked over to his laptop, studying the files. Videos appeared on the screen, street footage of the same police officers who had humiliated the woman. But something about the footage was even more shocking. The video showed moments when these officers behaved aggressively toward other people, broke the rules, used their power to manipulate. This is terrible," the lawyer muttered, his face darkening. "This is far beyond their authority. If we make this public, they won't be able to escape responsibility." "They're used to thinking they can get away with it," the man said, "but you have a chance to change that. Together, we can make this public." The woman stared at the screen, her eyes full of pain and anger. But now, there was hope mixed in with that anger, hope that she could not only protect herself, but help others. "What do we need to do?" she asked, her voice firm. The man turned to her. "We have to prepare everything. Send these materials to the media. Advocacy organizations. Attract as much attention as possible. The more people know, the harder it will be for them to hide the truth. The lawyer nodded. It's dangerous, but if we do it right, it will make a difference. We will hold them accountable. Meanwhile, at the police station, the officers who had previously humiliated the woman Saturday at his desk, his face tense. He had received a message mentioning journalists inquiring about the recent incidents. He felt uneasy. His partner entered the office, his face equally pale. They know something, the partner said, nodding at the message. We need to do something. Calm down. The officers replied, but there was no confidence in his voice. We'll figure it out. But that anxiety did not leave him. He knew that something had gone wrong, that their power no longer protected them. An inner fear began to take hold of him, like a wave covering everything around him. Meanwhile, a woman, a lawyer, and their ally continued to plan their actions. Every step was thought out, every word written down. The night dragged on endlessly, but in this night, a new day was born, a day that would bring justice. The light in the room was on as they worked towards their goal, and although fear was still present, it was now giving way to hope and confidence. Events were starting to turn against those who were used to abusing their power, and this was only the first step on the long road to justice. The policeman's office went silent. The silence was unnatural, oppressive, as if the room itself knew that the confidence that had once fueled his actions was beginning to crumble. The officer Saturday at his desk, his gaze glued to the computer screen. On the screen was a letter from a local newspaper reporter. It was short, but the words cut like a knife. We have received information regarding your involvement in a recent incident. We request your comment. He read it over several times, hoping it was some kind of prank or mistake, but inside, he felt cold. The journalist had mentioned a place, a date, even details that only the participants would know. It was a signal. Someone was watching. Someone knew. It was no longer a secret. His actions, which he had considered routine, had suddenly become a weapon against him. What are we going to do? Asked his partner, who was nervously pacing the office, avoiding looking the officers in the eye. I don't know, he muttered. They were words that had never come from his lips before. He was used to feeling in control, in power, in authority, but now those feelings were fading, replaced by a fear he couldn't contain. They started digging. The partner continued. First the journalists, then maybe the lawyers. If this comes out, shut up, the officer barked, slamming his fist on the table, but his voice was not loud, but rather broken. He himself understood that his partner was right. His mind was racing. He recalled every moment on the street that night, every word, every action. He thought he was in control, that he could afford to be rude, sarcastic, but now it felt like someone was watching his every move. The inner voice that had always calmed him now said one thing. You made a mistake. You went too far. We have time, he finally said, but even to him the words sounded unconvincing. We'll say it was protocol, that she was acting suspiciously. No one will believe them if we stand our ground. His partner looked at him doubtfully. Did you see her? He asked. She made no threats, and everyone who was there knows that. If the tapes surface, nothing will save us. These words struck harder than any argument. The officer stood up, his hands shaking. He went to the window and looked out. The darkness outside was threatening, as if the night itself was now against him. We have to do something, he muttered, as if to himself. We have to find out who's behind this. His mind raced. He knew that going back to the woman and her lawyer was a risk. If they were already prepared, any move could become a trap, but remaining inactive was even more frightening. He no longer felt untouchable. He knew that his power was an illusion, crumbling at the slightest collision with reality. Meanwhile, across town, the woman and her lawyer continued to work with the man who had provided the tapes. The entire process was steeped in the same tension. They knew that anything from threats to bribes could be used against them, but now they had a weapon, the truth, captured on camera. Are you sure you're ready to go all the way? The lawyer asked, looking straight at the woman. Her answer was firm. Yes. They think they can break me, but I won't give them that chance. Her words echoed in the officer's head as he called his superiors, trying to formulate a line of defense. But even the boss, who had once been a trusted ally, now spoke in a dry, almost detached tone. Sort this out, he said. Make sure nothing gets to the press. The officers realized that even those who were on his side were now ready to turn away if the situation became too dangerous. He no longer felt the confidence that had previously allowed him to act without thinking. Now every step was surrounded by fear. Every bell, every door could be the beginning of the end. His hands shook as he Saturday back down at the table. He realized that for the first time in a long time, he was afraid of the truth that was now working against him, afraid of the people he had thought weaker than himself, who were now stronger, and most of all, he was afraid of the consequences that he knew were inevitable. The policeman Saturday at his desk, surrounded by a pile of papers that resembled a protective wall, but that wall was crumbling with each passing minute. The anxiety in his chest had turned into a cold fear that prevented him from concentrating. He remembered the woman's face in the car, her confidence that challenged his authority. Her words echoed in his head, "I defend my rights." Now he realized that her calm was just the tip of the iceberg. There was something bigger beneath the surface, something that could destroy his life. The partner returned to the office, his face expressing a mixture of fatigue and concern. "They're coming for us," he said, closing the door behind him. "Journalists are gathering information. I heard they have recordings in their hands. They're threatening to publish them." The policeman looked up, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "What records?" he asked sharply. "Who does this?" The partner shrugged, looking down. "I know. They say someone filmed everything from a surveillance camera. It's not just us. It's everything that happened in the last months. Other cases, other victims." The words hit the policeman like a hammer blow. He felt cold sweat running down his back. Events that had seemed insignificant to him could now turn into a nightmare. Every incident, every little thing that he considered routine, could become evidence against him. "It's just rumors," he muttered, trying to convince himself. No one can prove anything. But his voice sounded uncertain, and his partner noticed it. "You don't understand," the partner said, his voice quiet but tense. "They're serious. These aren't just complaints. This is an expose." The cop felt his breathing become shallow. He knew his partner was right. This situation was beyond his control. His phone suddenly rang, and he jumped. The screen showed an unknown number. Hesitantly, he pressed the answer button. "Is that you?" came a voice from the other end. It was the boss's voice, cold, distant, but full of hidden irritation. "What are you doing there? Do you know how many calls I've received in the last 2 hours? It's not my fault." The policeman began to justify himself. "It's all blown out of proportion. They're trying to blacken our name." "The slander." That chief laughed, but there was nothing funny in his laughter. "They already did it. If this goes to court, you will be thrown out, and no one will raise their voice for you, not even me." The policeman fell silent. His heart was pounding, and he could feel the sweat beating on his forehead. The chief continued, "Take it away, quickly. Find who is spreading the information and shut them up. We have no room for error." The call ended. The policeman Saturday staring at the phone as his boss's words echoed in his head. He stood up and walked to the window. Everything looked calm outside, but the calm was deceptive. He knew there was a storm waiting for him outside. Meanwhile, in another part of town, the disabled woman, her lawyer, and their new ally continued to prepare. The lights were on in their little shelter, and videos were open on the computer screen. Each video was evidence of abuse. Each word on the tape a weapon against those who had grown to feel untouchable. "Are we ready?" the woman asked, her voice firm but with a hint of excitement. The lawyer nodded. "Everything is going according to plan. We will send these materials to journalists and human rights organizations. Once this comes out, they will have no chance." The man who had provided the note stood nearby, his arms crossed over his chest. He looked calm, but his eyes were strained. "They will fight," he said. "They will do everything to stop us. Let them try," the woman replied, her gaze filled with determination. "We have truth on our side." They understood that this was only the beginning. They would face threats, pressure, perhaps attempts to discredit them, but they were ready to fight for justice, even if it required enormous efforts. The policeman walked out of the station, his hands clenched into fists. He felt time was running out. He had to do something, but he didn't know where to start. Fear paralyzed him, preventing him from thinking clearly. All he knew was that if he didn't stop this, his career, his life, would be ruined. He was getting into his car when he noticed something taped to the windshield. It was a printout of a photo taken from a surveillance camera. It showed him humiliating a woman. Under the photo was written, "The truth will soon come out." His hands began to shake. He looked around, but the street was empty. Only shadows, only the cold night wind that seemed to laugh at him. Now he knew that they would not stop, and this knowledge scared him more than anything. A policeman Saturday in his office, surrounded by a silence that he found unbearable. The sounds of the street outside no longer brought the comfort they were accustomed to, but instead became a reminder that his world was crumbling. His entire life, built on the power he had come to consider an integral part of himself, was now falling apart. The phone on his desk was silent. His colleagues avoided him, and his superiors no longer concealed their irritation. He replayed the events of that night over and over in his head. The woman in the car, her calm, her dignity. He thought he could suppress it, but now he realized it was the beginning of his end. Snippets of conversation swirled in his head, phrases he had thrown out with such disdain now echoing like accusations. At that moment the office door opened. His boss walked in, his face stern. He slowly closed the door behind him and walked up to the desk. "We have a problem," he said, sitting down opposite. "And that problem is you." The policeman felt his stomach clench. He expected support, but instead he heard only coldness in his boss's voice. "This case is out of control," the chief continued. "Journalists, lawyers, human rights activists, they want blood, your blood." "But I was just doing my job." The policeman tried to justify himself, but his voice was weak. "Your job?" The boss raised his eyebrows. "You call humiliating a defenseless woman work? Do you realize that now we are all involved in this? Did you think that your uniform gave you the right to do everything?" The policeman fell silent. He saw that the chief had already made his verdict, and this verdict was not in his favor. "You're alone," the chief continued. "I'm not going to protect you. We'll do everything we can to save face for the department, but it'll be at your expense. You've painted yourself into this corner." The chief stood up and headed for the exit. Before leaving, he stopped at the door and added, "Tomorrow morning, you will be summoned to the prosecutor's office. Get ready." Meanwhile, the disabled woman and her lawyer watched the events unfold. The news of a police officer's abusing his power was all over the place. People were discussing her story on social media. Human rights groups were expressing their support, and posters with her image and the words, "Justice exists," appeared on the streets. She Saturday in the news studio, preparing to give an interview. Her voice was calm, but there was a sense of power in it. She told her story, emphasizing that it was not just about her, but about everyone who had ever experienced injustice. "This isn't about revenge," she said, looking straight into the camera. "This is about no one being afraid to stand up for their rights anymore. We can't be silent when we see injustice." The next day, the policeman Saturday in the interrogation room. In front of him lay a folder of evidence, photographs, videos, witness statements. His lawyer Saturday next to him, but he no longer tried to defend him. He knew the case was lost. "Do you have anything to say?" the prosecutor asked, his voice stern but fair. The policeman wanted to say something, but he couldn't. His voice was trembling, and his eyes were filled with fear. He was no longer the coffin man who could order anyone to shut up. Now he was just an accused who realized that the truth was stronger. The woman stood in the square, surrounded by people who had come to support her. She looked at the crowd, her heart filled with gratitude. People were chanting her name, but she raised her hand, asking for silence. "This is our victory," she said, "but this is only the beginning. We must continue to fight for justice, for equality, for the right to be heard. Each of us can make the world a better place if we do not remain silent." The crowd burst into applause. Her story had inspired thousands of people, and she knew it was only the first step. Justice had been served, but her fight for goodness and justice had only just begun. What do you think about this story? Have you ever experienced injustice or discrimination? How did you cope? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments. Your voice is important to us, and we value each of you. If this story touched you, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new inspiring stories and topics that really matter. Your participation makes us stronger. We wish you a wonderful day and justice in every step you take.